Good evening and welcome back. We are on number 3 of 4 on C.S. Lewis. If you haven't had a chance to see any of the previous episodes, now we can say episodes because we're recording, those are online in the live stream area of our interwebs. So, welcome those of you who are watching. We hope that you enjoy our time together. Let me switch screens to the slides. Okay, I'm going to start this recording too. Okay, here we go. Off to the races. To review, first week we studied C.S. Lewis's life, his early life, up to his employment at Oxford University. In the second week, we took his time up to his conversion to Christianity and his blossoming career. He gets a tutorship at Oxford University and steady income and all of that. So I'm not going to review much tonight because I've got plenty to do. Tonight we want to talk about his rise to fame and also some difficulties that he goes through during this period. As many of you know, September 1st, 1939 marks the beginning of World War II, and it is a huge problem. Warren, his brother, if you remember, was also in the military. He's been in the reserves since the end of the First War, and he's recalled immediately to active duty. So he leaves and goes to France. And during this time, the Kilns, that's their house, would host evacuees from London who are trying to escape air raids in London. And so he's got all these children really in his house for the first time, and we may touch on that in a little bit, what that was like for them. Lewis is nervous that he's going to have to serve in another war, and he is reassured that he will not have to serve, so he volunteers to be a member of the Home Guard, and their job, I mean, they even wear uniforms and they have weapons, but they're protecting the area. If any of you guys know Jay Kessler and have listened to him often in chapel, he used to make these great jokes about protecting Muncie, right? So during I think it's the Korean War, correct me guys if I don't have the timeline's quite right, that he was protecting Muncie during the Korean War. He's on this Home Guard, and so I wanted to, just remember that because it's so funny when he would say that. But at first, it seemed to him to just be kind of ridiculous. I mean, he's on patrol in the middle of the night, from like 1 to 4 in the morning, carrying a rifle around Oxford, protecting Oxford. But then he also comes to realize that that's a real peaceful time, place to kind of enjoy the evening. No thanks. We talked last week about the really close and important friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. Because of the war, this Charles Williams fellow that we mentioned a little bit last week when we were talking about the Inklings, this group of guys that are interested in literature, Charles Williams comes to live much closer by. He used to live in London. Now he is there in Oxford and is able to join the Inklings. And he and C.S. Lewis hit it off. And that growing friendship with the novelist and poet Charles Williams changes the dynamic between Tolkien and Lewis, and in ways that are just make it so that Tolkien and Lewis aren't quite as close as they used to be, and so that becomes a interesting development. Charles Williams is very important to C.S. Lewis. This friendship is very important. The literary stimulation and the help that he is to Lewis in their friendship. Now, Warnie is discharged after less than a year and returns home the following August in 1940, and the we're not totally sure why he's discharged so soon. McGrath, in the biography that I'm reading to present to you, the comments are terse. He doesn't have like a dishonorable discharge, but we know later that Warney struggles with alcoholism, and they're wondering if that's already in play, leading to an early discharge from his service in 1940. So he's back at the kilns. Maureen, whom is living there with Mrs. Moore and Lewis and Warney, she gets married in 1940 and moves out. And that's an important development because she actually did quite a bit to help Mrs. Moore. And so when she leaves, more of the care for Mrs. Moore, as she begins to get more and more difficult to care for, falls to Lewis. So Lewis didn't really like her husband initially, but McGrath says that they actually are pretty helpful to Lewis later in the timeline. So that's an interesting development. Now, during this time, during this war period, actually before the war, from 37 to 44, Tolkien is struggling to write The Lord of the Rings. And McGrath refers to Lewis as a midwife for this great work. So last week we talked about how important Tolkien is to sort of be a midwife to C.S. Lewis's new birth. That the conversation that they have is really important to take Lewis past that last barrier that he referred to. But now the friendship is working in this direction where Lewis is really encouraging Tolkien to finish this work. Tolkien is a perfectionist, and he wants to just keep tweaking the thing because it's never quite right. And he has that kind of personality that years go by and there's not a lot of progress made. It's not being published because he's just constantly tweaking it. The analogy is made that he likes to paint leaves more than trees, right? So imagine a painter who's just obsessed with getting all these leaves just right on a tree, and you're like, hey man, it's a tree. Just, ship, publish, get it out there. So Lewis is going to be really important to, keeping him going. So here's some interesting quotes for you. Tolkien began to read chapters of The Lord of the Rings to Lewis at their private meetings on Monday mornings and was encouraged by Lewis's reactions. Indeed, at points, Lewis was reduced to tears. Sections of the work began to feature regularly at Inklings meetings, often generating high praise from some, but not all. Hugo Dyson took an intense dislike to the book and regularly attempted to prevent its being read at the meetings. In the end, Lewis often had to intervene. Shut up, Hugo! Come on, Toller. So this interesting dynamic, and if you don't like Lord of the Rings, great. Maybe you like Hugo Dyson. We're glad that he didn't prevail in these meetings because I happen to be a fan. I won't say we, I definitely am a huge fan. So the unpayable debt, this is Tolkien's own words, after Lewis died, the unpayable debt that I owe to Lewis was not influence as is ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. He was, for long, my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. I love that. So this idea that you could have that kind of testimony of encouragement and relentless support and to bring a great work to the benefit of all of us is one of our takeaways for this evening. Now, many of you may have encountered C.S. Lewis through his work as a Christian apologist, arguing for the faith, helping us get rid of defeater beliefs, helping us to understand a little bit more about Christianity. And so he begins his first kind of apologetical writings in 1940. He's 42 years old. He publishes The Problem of Pain, in which he's wrestling intellectually with suffering and Christianity's explanatory power regarding the tension that we all live in between suffering God's goodness and his power. So many of us have heard, and if you haven't, that's okay, of sort of this classic trilemma of the problem of evil. How can there be, if God is omnibenevolent or all goodness, and he's omnipotent, has all this power, then why evil? How do all of those three things kind of come together in an intellectually and emotionally satisfactory way? You know, many atheists and agnostics who will cite the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, as their principal reason to not believe. And so this is Lewis going in to show that actually Christianity does have significant explanatory power for the problem of evil. By the way, you don't escape the problem of evil in any other philosophy or in any other religion. You just go someplace else. We talked last week about you leave one system into another one. You don't resolve all the problems in this system. You may kind of resolve some of them, but you pick up a whole new list. There are problems that we have, questions that we have on this side with our peanut brains that we just won't completely understand. So Lewis makes this move to Jesus to help resolve the tension between God's goodness, his power, and the problem of evil in the incarnation of God in Christ. The incarnation of God in Christ must be the focus of a Christian answer to the problem of pain, because the suffering is taken on by God himself to bring humanity to a greater good than there would have been otherwise. Here's a quote I'll try to unpack for you. The world is a dance in which good descending from God is disturbed by evil arising from the creatures. And the resulting conflict is resolved by God's own assumption, that is taking on, of the suffering nature which evil produces. The doctrine of the free fall asserts that the evil, which thus makes the fuel or raw material for the second and more complex kind of good, is not God's contribution, but man's. Where does evil come from? The free fall. God made humans. They had free will. They used it to rebel. And that rebellion is the raw material or the fuel for a second and more complex kind of good, a greater good through the redemption that is brought by the Son of God becoming human, suffering human for us in our behalf. And so he's going to say, don't dismiss Christianity too quickly, because the incarnation of Jesus actually does provide explanatory power for the problem of evil in this world. So that's a little bit complicated. Obviously, we're going to engage some of his ideas that are better taken on slowly at book length, but there it is. The problem of pain. Now, also during this time, the British Broadcasting Corporation is concentrating its resources on a single domestic radio broadcasting service now known as the Home Service. So the BBC had all these local stations, a radio network, and during the war, in order to help people, not only the soldiers, but all the civilians living there, have this home service programming. All of the programming is going to be the same. And religion was widely recognized at that time to be an integral aspect of the national fabric. And the BBC saw itself as having a duty to offer both religious instruction and inspiration in the darker moments of the war. So it's just really interesting to think about a day and age, a time in which there was a value in religion to console and comfort and help people during the war, and that's going to be part of the broadcast. So you have the voice of gardening, right, to help people, with their morale. You have the voice of medicine. Dr. So-and-so is going to come in and talk about health, but you're also going to have the voice of religion who's going to come in and give some consolation, some teachings. And so they're looking for a trans-denominational voice of faith, because the BBC did not want to get into a denominational fight in England where there are contentious parties denominationally between the Church of England and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians. They're looking for somebody who's trans-denominational so that they can give religious broadcasting that isn't sectarian or locked into a particular faith tradition. So that's what they're looking for. And they found that voice in Lewis. Last week we talked about him having this fantastic voice, and they come in, they do a voice test. He's not only good in the lecture hall, but that he called it a pudding voice. Last week we talked about him having this rich voice, that it worked well for radio too. And they knew about him because of the book, The Problem of Pain, that he had published. It was helpful that he was a layman because that separated him from the church politics. He's not actually a clergy person in one of these denominations. He is a layman. It helps that he has credentials related to Oxford University as an Oxford Don and someone who valued mere Christianity. So besides all of those things related to his voice, these things are all kind of converging on his person to be the voice of religion for the BBC. Now, interestingly, before the broadcast started, he had already been giving talks. He was being invited to be a guest speaker to the Royal Air Force, and these are important opportunities for him to put his ideas into uneducated language. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you're a professor and you're used to using the shorthand of your field of study, by the way, all fields of study, including blue-collar fields of study, have a shorthand for making long paragraphs and long sentences smaller. And so you can talk to an electrician, you can talk to a mechanic, you can talk to somebody who knows a lot about these things, and they can completely snow you in the technical jargon of their trade. And everyone has to work to translate themselves to be accessible to help you understand what really is wrong with my car or whatever. So Lewis, because of these talks to the servicemen at the Royal Air Force, is having to figure out how to leave the university and speak to these airmen in ways that they are able to understand in an accessible way. And it turned out to be an important exercise for him. Here's something that he says about it actually helping him clarify his thought. You must translate every bit of your theology into the vernacular or the common way of speaking. This is very troublesome, and it means you can say very little in half an hour. Why? Because your shorthand is taken away, and that makes your sentences longer, makes your paragraphs longer. But he'll say, but it is essential. It is also of the greatest service to your own thought. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Isn't that interesting? Power to translate. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. And that's powerful and important to me. I think if you think about the best teachers that you've had, they are able to do this really, really well. They're able to size up the room. They're able to figure out who they're talking to. They're able to adjust in their mind their words to talk to this person. And so, I had professors that could speak so brilliantly, all this jargon at the highest level of their field, who could also come into a church and do a children's sermon that was super clear. And I think, Pastor Mark isn't here, so we can talk about him even more, right? He's not here. He does this. When the kids come up, you should see. It's really fun because I get to sit up there when Pastor Mark is doing the children's sermon. But I'm not just watching the kids and listening to the funny things they say. I'm watching y'all because you guys, you really lean in during the children's sermon. There is something extra special going on in the children's sermon. I think part of it is because the translation work of maybe a difficult theological truth, he's had to work extra hard to bring in an object lesson or some sort of thing to make that more accessible to the kids, and it's helping all of us because it's being more accessible to all of us. So power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning, and it is not easy. But that work at the RAF is preparing him now for the radio. See how those work together? The radio talks, he decided, would be apologetic, not evangelistic. He was more interested in preparing the ground for the gospel rather than explicitly presenting it, especially in the early talks when he's trying to get the audience, right? So there's a ramp-up phase. Will they even listen to you? Are they going to tune in? And so you got to make a connection. It's got to be easy to understand. And if it's pre-evangelism, that's going to be helpful. If it's not sectarian, that's going to be helpful. So this is his strategy. He decided that he would try to attempt to convince people that there is a moral law, that we disobey it, and that the existence of a lawgiver is at least very probable. And we touched on this a little bit last week at the end of our time in the Q&A, the discussion about how important it was and these are ongoing important things to prepare the work of the gospel in people's hearts and minds, that you do have a sense of right and wrong, and you're constantly judging things by that sense of right and wrong. It's universal, and where does it come from? So he's asking these types of questions and giving pretty good answers for those things, that these things come from God. So initially the series title is called Right and Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. These things go through revisions, but here's the outline for the first series. So August 6th, I think this is 1940. First one's common decency. In all cultures, everywhere, there is a sense of common decency. All places, anywhere, you walk up to somebody and you shove them in the chest, they're going to be mad. They're going to be upset. They're going to be incensed. And why? Where does that come from? Why do we have this kind of sense of common decency? Scientific law and the moral law, materialism or religion. What can we do about it? These are the topics of the radio talks. And then there was a cancellation, so they brought him in for a fifth session to take questions from the audience. Now, that first series is very successful. Lots of people listen. So he's invited back to do a second series. Now, this time, those were on Wednesdays. Now, this time on Sundays in January and February of 1942. This time he does move a little bit closer or steps into Christianity. So that first time is kind of pre-evangelism. Can I help you if you're struggling, if you're an atheist, you're an agnostic, kind of get you on board with the idea of God. Now he's moving more toward a distinctly Christian message. He consulted with clergy from Presbyterians, the Roman Catholics, Methodists, and the Church of England in order to make sure that his presentation was this sort of trans-denominational orthodoxy, which he eventually starts to call mere Christianity, a trans-denominational Christianity that all of these folks would agree, yes, I recognize my faith in what you are saying, at least at its most basic levels without its denominational layers. So trans-denominational, but some criticism early was that it was awfully individualistic, which makes sense. If you're trying to talk to the radio to individuals to convince them about Christianity, and you're not interested so much in those radio talks to convince them about a certain church, Presbyterians, Methodists, etc., then you will just kind of, by doing that, you can imply that Christianity is kind of an individual thing. He's not emphasizing a particular church, and so some of the undertow is you're not really emphasizing any of the church. Now, when he goes and makes these radio talks and expands them into a book, he does address this. So we'll hook into that a little bit later this evening. The first two series get published kind of like as pamphlets. In July of 1942, they're called Broadcast Talks, and there's a quote about why he was picked. I gave these talks not because I am anyone in particular, but because I was asked to do so. I think they asked me chiefly for two reasons. Firstly, because I'm a layman, not a clergyman, and secondly, because I had been a non-Christian for many years. It was thought that both these facts might enable me to understand the difficulties that ordinary people feel about the subject. So very nice, concise way to put it. Notice how he translated himself. Because I'm a layman, not a clergyman. That's kind of a way to, what does layman even mean? I actually married a layman, Lehman, and so pretty happy about that. Now, the third series, he's invited to speak again. This now in November of 1942. This series is called Christian Behavior, and if just more concerned now about the ethics of Christianity. You perhaps think that Christianity is a lot of rules and it's a certain way of living, and so he kind of goes through and talks about Christian behaviors, and then he gives a fourth series of talks from February 22nd to April 4th, 2 years later. So during the course of the war, you can see now there are 4 different opportunities for him to give talks on the radio. Most of these were 30-minute sessions. Do I have that right? Maybe not. I'm going to go check that. I can't remember how long they were. Let's move on. By the end of the series, Lewis was a national celebrity. It really was true that he was the voice of religion. It was clear that the reactions of listeners varied considerably from near adulation to total contempt. But as Lewis pointed out to the producer, that reaction was probably more to the subject matter than to him as a speaker. And he makes a comment. It's an old story, isn't it? They love or hate. So Christianity, as Jesus has said in the Bible, is a wedge, and it divides, and it really says more about the person listening, perhaps, than the content of the message. I'll just continue. Now, 8 years later is when those talks get reworked into the classic that many of you have read called Mere Christianity. So there's a gap now of a considerable amount of time. A lot of stuff is going to happen in the rest of the 40s before we get to the early 50s when that's published. So my plan tonight is to do what McGrath does, is to kind of set Mere Christianity right here, talk a little bit more about what was happening in the 40s, and then come back to it in its published form in the early 50s later tonight to work through some of the things that are in that book. So we're handling it in 2 places because it is in 2 places. It's during the war, and then it's also in the early 50s as a book. So we're going to shift slightly to talk about the screw tape letters. Now, it's the radio broadcasts that make Lewis famous in England, but it's the screw tape letters, actually, that make him super famous in America. So America's not listening to his radio broadcast. They're reading the screw tape letters. The screw tape letters is a highly original fiction book. If you've read it, you know that it's a series of letters from a higher ranking devil to an understudy about how to tempt someone. And so each writing is written like a letter. My dear Wormwood, and he kind of goes through and he insidiously tries to teach this understudy how to tempt someone, how to get them thinking this instead of that, and also where the blunders are made, and how the church is you have to figure out how to undermine that guy's church experience because what's happening there is not good, and it's making it harder for you to pull him your way. So it's just a really interesting thing, and it made him very popular in the United States. Screw tape consolidated Lewis's reputation as a popular Christian theologian, someone who is able to communicate the themes of the Christian faith in an intelligent and accessible way. He has figured out how to talk to the masses through this experience. And notice he's still highly interested in using very creative literature to do so. It's not just arguments. It's trying to envision or use your imagination or use even art in order to paint a vista or show a vision of Christianity, which is going to be a major theme. This is so important that Oxford's senior theologian at the time wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury expressing his view that Lewis deserved to be awarded an Oxford Doctorate of Divinity, the highest degree Oxford could offer, in recognition of his theological writings. He remarked that Lewis, along with Dorothy L. Sayers, was one of the few British writers who then seemed to be able to put across to ordinary people a reasonably orthodox form of Christianity. That is an amazing sentiment. It is amazing because we're going to find out that his popular writings actually create a ton of animosity towards him in Oxford, because it's not academic enough. Like, what are you doing? You're a tutor of English, and you're over here writing popular theology. So this sentiment from this theologian is important to me, because I sense in him a heart for the church. I mean, he obviously cares that somebody has been able to speak to the people in this way enough that he just thought that he deserved a degree for it. So that didn't happen, but it's just a fascinating thing to read. And probably the majority position, but maybe not the majority position at Oxford. We'll continue to talk about that. So his fame continues to rise, yet Lewis's academic reputation at Oxford was not well served in this way. In the Screwtape Letters, he had unwisely declared himself to be a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, on the book's title page. There was much grumbling and sniping in Magdalen's senior common room about the devaluation of the academic currency by such a rampantly populist book. Lewis won the hearts and minds of many through his book, yet he also alienated many whose support he might need if he were to secure an Oxford chair in the future. So that represents a promotion in the university. He would like to be a professor instead of a tutor. Those are called chairs. And though he's served the war effort through his radio talks and has written this immensely popular book that actually doesn't help him professionally at Oxford to advance as a serious scholar, and it's ticked off quite a few people there. So I already said this, but later Lewis is going to turn the radio series into a book called Mere Christianity. He publishes it in 1952. That title actually comes from the earlier writings of Richard Baxter, who's a Puritan writer, who is using that term to refer to the fundamentals of the Christian faith, the core to which the denominations subscribe and then express in their own ways. And there's a very famous image that I would love for you all to just kind of have in your minds always, is that he describes mere Christianity like a hall out of which doors open into several rooms. His goal is to bring anyone he can into the hall. That's my goal. I'm just going to bring you into the hall. But it is in the rooms, not in the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. The hall is a place to wait in, a place from which to try the various doors, not a place to live in. So this is his way to answer the criticism that the radio talks were expressing a pretty individualistic form of Christianity. Where's the church? Because the trade-off was, in order to reach all the churches, we're going to go church light in this trans-denominational kind of way. Well, this is what he's going to say. I'm trying to bring you into that hallway, but it's on you to go into the rooms and try it out for yourself, because you can't live in the hallway. Now, trying to decide if I want to comment on this later or now. I think I'll just comment on it now. As a pastor living in the 21st century, I think we got a ton of people trying to live in the hall. So there has been an institutional decline, and it has a lot of factors. A lot of it can be related to the easy access to media. So there's probably a lot of people out there that consider church listening to a sermon and go on a walk and maybe queuing up some worship songs in their iTunes or whatever music thing that they're listening to, completely alone. I had a professor at DTS. He was an expat. His dad was an oil man, and he lived all over the world. And in this way, he really wanted to be one of the Boy Scouts of America. Well, you can imagine that there probably aren't a lot of Boy Scouts America when you're living in Turkey or Africa or wherever it was that he was living. And so he talks about how his dad figured out how to get him on the Lone Scout program, where you could get the Boy Scouts of America manual, and you could get your uniform, and you could buy yours. I wish that you could hear Dr. Bingham talk about this, because he'd be like, I would go camping by myself. I would build a fire by myself. And he just kept going through all of these merit badge things, and he just kept emphasizing, by myself, and to just kind of point to, it's kind of a ludicrous idea to be in the Lone Scout program and think that you're part of the Boy Scouts of America. And yet we have a similar issue. We have lots of people who may be very devout, but they don't like institutional church. They're resistant to institutional church. Maybe they have really good reasons. Maybe they've been burned by it. Obviously, it seems like you can't go more than a week or two before you hear about another high-profile scandal. There's abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we continue to go further and further into our individualness, and that's not Lewis's vision. And whatever creative ways that we can help people to move out of that and into the family in an embodied way around the table together, then that is one of my highest pastoral agenda items for my career. This analogy, or this hallway analogy, enables us to appreciate the essential point that Lewis wished to make, that there is a notional or a theological trans-denominational form of Christianity, which is to be cherished and used as the basis of Christian apologetics. Yet, the business of becoming or being a Christian requires commitment to a specific form of this basic Christianity. Another way to frame it in the biblical metaphor is you hear people say, I like Jesus, I hate the church. Well, that's as ludicrous as somebody saying to me, Dan, I like you, I'm not too keen on Deidre, right? Because the Bible talks about the church being Christ's bride. And so the way we cherish Christ is by cherishing the local church. And so trying to help people move out of their resistance into a place of warm acceptance is the task. Mere Christianity might take primacy over individual denominations, yet those denominations are essential to the business of Christian living. Lewis was not advocating mere Christianity as the only authentic form of Christianity. His argument was rather that it underlies and nourishes all those forms. I love that. And so in Mere Christianity, he avoids on purpose tier 2, quote, squabbles about 3 B's, baptism, bishops, or the Bible. So obviously, if you start going down that hallway and you enter those different rooms, there are going to be differences about modes of baptism, right? There's going to be differences on church governments. Ought we or ought not we have bishops? And what do we think about the Bible, right? So different rooms have different ways of thinking about this, and that's where a lot of, particularly in this part of the 20th century, a lot of the squabbles are coming from, and why there's a desire to kind of get above the fray to offer this beautiful religion. His apologetic strategy is experiential or visionary. He does not begin with arguments defending Christian teachings. Lewis makes us think that we're listening to an argument when in reality we are presented with a vision. And it is that vision that carries conviction. This vision appeals to the human longing for truth, beauty, and goodness. Lewis's achievement is to show that what we observe and experience fits in with the idea of God. Now this quote, if you've been with us for a couple weeks, is hooking into like how he himself became converted. That finally there's a way to integrate my ginormous brain and my huge imagination in a way that makes sense of all of my experience. So he's not so much interested in proofs and proof texting and arguing people in. He's remember a couple weeks ago we talked about, much more interested in walking over to the window and throwing open the curtains and saying, look at this. And it's going to be pretty integrated in all of his writings, that there's a central cohesion to these types of commitments. So what he does is he talks about clues. He likes this word clues in Mere Christianity. He uses clues which, taken individually, do not prove anything, but when considered cumulatively, build a case for believing in God. So he's not trying to come up with like this special key, but rather an array. Remember, he used a chessboard analogy. You don't win a chess game with one move. You win a chess game with an array of moves that have a cumulative kind of trap effect to narrow down the deal until you've got a compelling deal. So he keeps using clues. Clues from the moral law. Since there is this common decency everywhere, that strongly infers a lawgiver. There's universal human longing. And one way to interpret that longing is that those are all deeply embedded echoes of our true homeland. If you think about some of the themes that we talked about earlier. And then sense-making. Last week I showed you a clip from Sam Albury, which was in 1 minute saying Christianity has tremendous explanatory power for helping us make sense of the world. And Lewis is very interested in kind of doing that, showing, see, doesn't this kind of make sense from kind of the way you experience the world? Doesn't this kind of make sense from the way you experience the world? So he's putting forth Christianity's explanatory power as something that's compelling. And if you were to read modern apologists, Timothy Keller comes to mind. His book that's kind of equivalent to Mere Christianity is called The Reason for God. In fact, if you've got a friend that is not a believer but might be a little bit interested, I would actually recommend starting with Reason for God, not Mere Christianity. We'll talk a little bit about why. But Keller not only talks about the explanatory power of Christianity, but he also tries to show how the other options are dead ends. So he'll do some deconstruction on secularism and say, look, it doesn't have the same explanatory power as the Christian religion. And so that's a pretty powerful way to help people come along. I'll talk a little bit more at the end of tonight about Mere Christianity, but I'm going to move on to other projects. He's an amazing lecturer, and he turns some of those lectures into books. One of them is a scholarly work called A Preface to Milton's Paradise Lost. It's still on reading lists of Milton scholars to this day. It's considered important. He also wrote a work called The Abolition of Man, in which he is trying to argue that there really is objective truth apart from your subjective experience. That book is pretty hard to read these days. But McGrath says it remains relevant because the whole idea of objective and subjective truth is still hotly debated in our culture and in our academic circles. Next, the Great Divorce, 1944. This is important to a lot of us. It's not an allegory strictly in the sense, but a supposal. And so McGrath said that Lewis loves allegory, but he also loves a slightly different thing called a supposal. And he got in trouble a little bit with the Great Divorce because the Great Divorce is this idea that you've got people that he's in hell, and this might be what hell's like, and then they get on a bus and they go up to heaven, and they can kind of explore around in heaven a little bit. Some people stay, a bunch of people get back on the bus and go back to hell. And he's trying to explain a lot of like really important biblical theology about heaven and hell, about the way humans are, what salvation is. But people took it a little bit too allegorically, thinking that he was doing theological speculation. And Lewis is like, no. I'm like, what would it look like if we supposed that it looked like this? What could we learn? So he likes to take theological ideas, throw them into a new world, play with them a little bit to help us illustrate in a better and an interesting way than what we're used to when we get kind of stuck in our thinking. So the Great Divorce is not a true allegory, it's a supposal. He calls it, and he points it out in the preface, what it is and what it isn't. People still got a little bit upset, but I think it's helped a ton of people. Perhaps the most important feature of The Great Divorce is Lewis's demonstration, by art of narrative rather than by force of argument, that people easily become trapped in a way of thinking from which they cannot break free. So if you know this book and you've been listening to this book or you read this book Character after character after character is stuck in a certain way of thinking. And that stuckness, if they don't break out of it, is what causes them to either disappear or get back on the bus and go back to the bad place. And so, and that's an important thing. Those in hell, on exploring heaven, turn out to be so comfortable with their distorted view of reality that they choose not to embrace the truth on encountering it. And McGrath says this: Lewis uses familiar cultural stereotypes of his day, such as the career artist who is obsessed with the avant-garde or the most recent and edgy styles, or the theologically liberal bishop who's infatuated with his intellectual fame, in order to challenge the lazy, this is McGrath speaking, the lazy and unevidenced Enlightenment assumption that humans recognize and accept truth when they see it. Human nature, Lewis suggests, is rather more complex than this trite superficial rationalism shows. So perhaps we're used to hearing or thinking that humans are really good at recognizing and embracing truth when they see it. That it just sort of is self-evident, right? And universally compelling. And Lewis is arguing through this very creative narrative that actually, you know what? People believe what they want to believe. Even when faced with very compelling evidence to the contrary, they will twist it and warp it or until it fits some other narrative or reject it altogether. So actually, we're far more like what the biblical images is describing as sheep who are very smart and think in groups, the herding that goes on, than these brilliant Enlightenment intellectuals that sort of automatically find truth and gravitate towards truth and proclaim truth. So interesting. And he's showing his Augustinian commitments to a kind of a fallen idea of human nature, even the intellect being fallen, that academic work actually is spiritual work, because we are so easily led astray and we get stuck in our thinking. So, some other projects. Publishes Miracles in 1947. That's an apologetic work. He's arguing against naturalism and for miracles in other places. He's also doing some fiction writing. So if you guys have read, sometimes it's called the Space Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy. This comes in the 40s. The first one, Out of the Silent Planet, is published in 38. Paralandra, 1943, and That Hideous Strength in 1945. And it's interesting here because he is totally, within his fiction writing, still doing apologetics. He's using science fiction to expand the imagination. So he likes the form of science fiction because you get to imagine how your ideas would look in a totally different place. Remember that idea of supposal. Suppose this is true. Suppose it's like this. What would it look like if Christianity were in that kind of context? Would we learn something from seeing it over there? And he's using, so science fiction is on the rise, and scientism is on the rise, which is science as a secular religion, the worship of science, the idea that science will eventually solve all our problems and usher us into a utopia, that he's going to fight against that using that genre. He's also going to subvert through these books the popular eugenics of his time. So it's very popular among cultural elites and academic circles to be arguing for forced sterilization of people who aren't smart or incompetent or whatever, and he's going to argue against that counterculturally. Through his Christian theology in these works, that is no bueno. Forced sterilizations, no bueno. And the idea of vivisection. So vivisection is when you dissect an animal while it's alive. And it's considered by many to be very cruel. He's saying if we are brutal towards animals, we are just as likely to be brutal to our fellow humans, especially those we regard as inferior to us. So you imagine if you're starting to think that humans are simply like the highest evolved animals, and there isn't much of a difference, an essential difference between humans and animals. If you begin torturing animals, then you're only a small step from torturing humans, because where's the justification to stop you? And so this is one of the things I love about working with Mark Beal. Since he's not here, I'm going to continue to pick on him. Mark, if you're listening, hello. When I came, it didn't take very long where you kind of slip and you say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. He'd be like, hold it right there. We don't skin cats, Dan. We don't beat horses, dead or alive. And no, you don't kill birds with stones, right? So his love of animals, his veterinarian heart comes out when he corrects us. But there's a theology there that's important. That your care of animals is important. Now that brings up a whole discussion about the ethics related to animals, how we use animals to experiment, to learn things about medicine, how we get our food that we don't have time to go into tonight. But it's important to just recognize that Lewis is important to bioethicists. In fact, last week, Steve Phillips was here and he was talking about Lewis's writings are important to what he does as a bioethicist because he was engaging in this way. Also, his way of thinking about animals and how they are related to humans as fellow creatures, yet humans are stewards of these creatures. That whole theme is deeply in Narnia, right? How the humans treat the animals is important to the story. Whether the animals can talk or not is important to the story. So that's not only in the Ransom trilogy, but it will also be a theme in Narnia. So, on September 8th, 1947, Lewis appeared on the front cover of Time magazine in America with this glowing article. And then he has been, but particularly with this too, he's inundated with letters. Warney, his brother, helped him with the correspondence, and he estimated that he typed on a typewriter 12,000 letters trying to help Lewis with his correspondence. And it got to the point where he didn't even consult his brother. He's just answering his mail. Right? So, but the fame actually is a problem. It brings stress into their lives, and it's hard to deal with. Here's a funny quote. Warney also devised an imaginative technique for getting rid of the increasing number of self-important people who demanded to speak with Lewis at home personally by the telephone. His method was to lift the receiver and say, Oxford Sewage Disposal Unit, and go on repeating it until they went away. So that's pretty funny. The Time article, of course, irritated some academics, and the fame may have raised his profile, but it also made him a target. It made him a target to those who disliked his beliefs, but it also made him a target to those who viewed him as a sellout to popular culture and not a serious academic. At this point, his life kind of takes some turns towards some bad news. First, in 1945, Lewis's close friend, whom we mentioned tonight, Charles Williams, the poet, the novelist, the Inkling, he dies suddenly and is a crushing personal blow for Lewis. And then he goes through a series of not getting the professorships that he was hoping for. He's denied one in 47. He's denied again in 48. He's denied again in 51. So he cannot get promoted anymore at Oxford. So McGrath says he seems to be a prophet without honor in his own city and university. There's also difficulties in his personal life. Things are increasingly difficult at home because Mrs. Moore has dementia, and she's very hard on the domestic help that they bring in to take care of her. Remember that her daughter moved out, and so Warney additionally is fighting a losing battle with alcohol addiction, and it's bad enough that he periodically has to be hospitalized. So Lewis not only doesn't have Maureen to help him with Mrs. Moore, he also doesn't have Warney to help him with Mrs. Moore when he goes on these binges. By 1949, Lewis and Tolkien are no longer very close. They're friends, they love each other, but they're not in that intimate way, meeting weekly or multiple times per week. Tolkien has been promoted. He's got different duties at the university, but he will still fight for Lewis when there's an opportunity, a chair opens up, he will recommend him. In 1950, Mrs. Moore is admitted into a nursing home, but then, and it's super stressful because that's going to be really expensive, more money than C.S. Lewis has to figure out how to pay, while he's stressed out figuring out how he's going to pay for this situation. She dies from an influenza epidemic in 1951. And that actually opens up Lewis's life considerably. So after Mrs. Moore's death in 1951, Lewis is able to secure a year's sabbatical, and he just kind of puts his head down and he works like crazy. He makes major headway on a major academic work, a 700-page volume on 16th century English lit, and that's published in 54. And that book, McGrath says, his academic reputation was more than amply restored as a serious scholar. He's elected fellow of the British Academy the following year in 1955. However, it's kind of like too late for a lot of the decision makers at Oxford. He was a spent force, and had that idea, the perception that he was a spent force had crystallized. Also, he's kind of viewed as not an institution man. Like his views are kind of old world and not thinking about the way to advance the university with new scholars coming in who want to study newer literature, not all the old stuff. So his relationship with the university is increasingly fraught. Need to talk briefly about the Socratic Club. So Lewis was a faculty sponsor of a debate club at Oxford. The goal here is to engage those interested with apologetics of the Christian faith. So this is a place to go and argue. It's kind of like the Ravi Zacharias thing. You kind of go into a secular place, people can ask whatever they want, and maybe they're going to sponsor debates. And that's the Socratic Club. Is a very well-attended, very important group on campus. Now, Lewis, remember, had published his book called Miracles in 1947, in which he had argued against naturalism. Well, there's this incident, February 2nd, 1948. A young Catholic philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, who, by the way, is a Christian. She's on his side. She shares his convictions that naturalism is bankrupt. She points out problems in this public thing with his argument in Miracles. He said, actually, your argument in Miracles is not tight for these particular reasons. And so that some biographers who are not as sympathetic to Lewis, example A.N. Wilson, have grabbed onto this event as like a defeat that crushes Lewis and causes him to retreat from his role as an apologist into fiction. That's how Wilson and other biographies interpret this event. McGrath, in his work that's more sympathetic, however, argues that there's not enough support for this thesis. McGrath argues, however, that whatever Lewis's embarrassment, he did share with his friends embarrassment that this happened to him, but it was related to the public nature of the event, not to the fact that his argument was found wanting. Remember, Lewis is a professional literary critic. He's made his living and likes and does criticism, and his whole career up to this point has shown that he can give it and take it. And so the idea that he's going to be like completely undone by this brilliant young scholar and it's going to ruin him somehow is not easy to believe at this point. So not the fact that his argument was found wanting. Lewis even revises the chapter in Miracles after taking Anscombe's concerns into account. And the result, like if you were to get Miracles now, would be that chapter, much tighter argument because of this incident. McGrath says Lewis does not, if you've read this, retreat to fiction. And his supporting argument is this. Remember, Mere Christianity is published in 1952, after this happened, which is argument, right? And so he published this. And he was already using fiction before this event when he was writing the Ransom trilogy. So how do you retreat to something you're already using, is kind of McGrath's point. And he continues to publish reasoned arguments in later papers. So the thesis is, this is what McGrath says. Sadly, A.N. Wilson does not offer any compelling evidence for his suggestion that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe specifically grew out of Lewis's experience of being stung back into childhood by his defeat at the hands of Elizabeth Anscombe at the Socratic Club, or his amusing This is McGrath. Or his amusing but ultimately unevident suggestion that Lewis based The White Witch of Narnia on Anscombe. So I don't know what you guys have read, but that there is a little bit of debate about this, and McGrath is just so excellent. McGrath does note, as he goes on, though, that there is a shift in his career now for Lewis. Not because he got beat at a debate, but because he just feels that his role as a philosophical leading apologist might be over. That his role as a leading apologist was an important episode in his career, but not the end goal. McGrath. We can rightly see Narnia as the imaginative outworking of the core philosophical and theological ideas Lewis had been developing since the mid-30s, expressed in a narrative rather than a rational manner. The Narnia novel is expressed in the form of a story, the same philosophical and theological arguments advanced in miracles. Fiction becomes the means of allowing readers to see, more than that, to enjoy the vision of reality Lewis had already set out in his more apologetic works. And on the first night, I showed you a book that kind of takes you through more systematically the theology of Lewis. But right away, at the very beginning, he says, Lewis is coherent. He's got a theology, and it comes through in all of these different ways, but it's a unity, and this is expressed here by McGrath. So, to land the plane, tonight, we're going to notice some tensions. First, there's a tension between suffering and goodness that we all feel, right? When we suffer, it makes us ponder theologically what's going on with God. And that tension has been resolved most beautifully in Christianity, I would say. Now, I'm not standing up here saying that I've exhausted all of the different philosophies, but I am committed and convinced that there is a good God behind bitter providences who is working these things to a greater good. That part of the hope of heaven is to be able to see how those tensions get resolved. The glimpse that we get of how the tension is resolved in the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Christ is the best clue we have. The very best clue that we have. And so we drive people to consider the suffering God in order to help resolve the tension and the problem of evil. C.S. Lewis, his student, Timothy Keller, has an excellent book about this. And the elders read it one year as one of the texts that we kind of, every now and then the elders will read a book. But Lewis will say it's important to think about these things before the wheels of your life fall off. Because when you're in grief, everything gets a lot harder. So he's saying before the hard times come, study a little bit about pain and suffering. And then when you go through it, your heart, when it's being just torn apart, we'll have those tools at the ready. Because it's way harder to theologize about the problem of evil when you're grieving than it is before you are grieving. And so it's good, recommended, though it's hard to read and difficult to go there to learn a little bit about this. We'll talk a little bit more about suffering because Lewis is about to go through even more suffering, and how the other book that he writes about suffering is kind of like a set with the problem of pain. So that's coming next week. Second, we should notice that there's always a tension that exists between the academy, the world of the university, and the people, right? And this, right when I was interviewing for this position at UCC, that I was told by the leadership of the UCC, one of the things that we constantly struggle with is a cultural difference, a significant cultural difference between the town and the gown. You know what I'm going to say already, right? That education actually creates a cultural difference that is hard to figure out how to bridge. That you're actually doing cross-cultural ministry when you are a highly educated person trying to engage somebody who doesn't have what you have. You might as well be from Paraguay or some other really different place, trying to understand their experiences, trying to put your words into language they understand, trying to create the common ground that you need in order to share life together. And so we see that a little bit in this story that Lewis has to work hard to translate himself to the people. He got really, really good at it, and it made him famous, and he helped a lot of people. He's still helping us, by the way. But it also created a rift, right? A professional rift for him at Oxford that will plague him for the rest of his career. So we need, just as in number 1, to think about the synthesis between suffering and goodness and power in God. We should be the type of people that like to figure out and embrace, like that Oxford theologian, the idea that the academy and the people aren't at odds, but that they help one another, that there isn't too much pride and snobbery in the system in both directions, that we can't try to get along and be friends. And so I've often felt like that we have captains here in Upland who do this extremely well, that there isn't the type of, most of the time, the rift that occurs that in this way. So I could list example after example after example of how this church has sought to bridge those gaps, whether that's basics or lift or helping hand programs, the ways that we try to interface with the community. But it's definitely a high value in the core of our church. And I think that theologians that try to write popular works, I don't think that they should be punished in their career for that. That's somehow kind of a sellout or something. That they should be able to try to help people. So there's some comments on that. Thirdly, there is a tension between argument and imagination as an apologetic kind of way to engage. So that when Lewis finally had those two things integrated in himself, you can see, like the rest of his life, him working from that integration between reason and imagination to make just a massive influence that's still with us. So the integration between reason and imagination is there. That means, back to Howard Hendricks, when he says it's a sin to bore people with the Bible. if you're tasked with proclaiming Christian truth, that you need to be able to think well, but you also need to have some artistry and be able to show that this is not a boring book. This is actually the most compelling thing and the most amazing story ever told. So let's try to figure out how to well integrate argument and imagination. The people who are criticizing Lewis's children's work for not being deep enough, I don't think they got it. That is very profound stuff, and it's hooking back into other things that he wrote theologically and the philosophical arguments that he made. We'll talk next week more about Narnia. But before we stop, I just want to share with you for a couple minutes my story. So Mere Christianity actually is really important to my story, not because of the apologetics to kind of get ready the soil for my heart. I was saved at the age 5. But where he devastated me and changed my life forever is actually in the way Christians behave section when he gets to the chapter on pride. Chapter 8 is called The Great Sin. And I had a lot of it, and he showed it to me with these diagnostic questions in just a few paragraphs in a way that changed me forever and has put me on hopefully a lifelong pursuit on my face for figuring out how to kill that, what humility is, look for examples for humility, try to be like those people, in the meantime trying to be bold like Peter's bold, right? It's going to be bumbling. You're going to mess it up a lot of times. But Peter's a chastened man after his ordeals, and that's kind of how I feel and have felt since encountering that chapter in college. It changed everything. So I'm sorry I'm a little bit later than I meant to be, but I'd like to give you the last amount of time to talk. We have about 5 more minutes, so anything you would like to share? Sorry, it's a lot, guys. I knew when we set out that to try to cram Lewis into 4 sessions was actually insane. So thank you for being here and for your diligence. It's not easy. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Yes, Steve.
Does he have a translation for Mere Christianity?
Great question. So I meant to talk about this. Thank you for bringing it up. The question is there a translation for Mere Christianity? So McGrath points out that Mere Christianity isn't nearly as accessible now as it was when he was saying that stuff on the radio. So there's enough cultural difference, there's enough time difference, there's enough vocabulary choices that it's actually hard for 21st century Americans to read it. And I don't actually recommend people starting there. So I give them something else to start with that's easier. And if they really like Lewis or they're into some of his other writings and they want to take it on, then give it to them. The other strategy that I have is like you could try to listen to it. And some people that have felt like they're bogged down when they read, they start listening to it over and over and over again until the language, it's like you're doing Rosetta Stone or something. You can have an immersion experience. You're listening to this over and over and over again until it's sort of the repetition starts to make sense. I don't actually know of, besides talks and people kind of commenting on it, of a single source that's a translation of Mere Christianity to the modern era. I do think that Timothy Keller's Reason for God is the closest thing that I would say is in this category, but it's still not like that project is not a translation of Mere Christianity. It's like an apologetic work for the 21st century. So, say again. Spiritual successor. Yeah, some would argue that Timothy Keller is Lewis's spiritual successor, closest thing that we have right now living. Great question. Yes.
When I taught honor students at Taylor for 3 years, I had them read Mere Christianity with 33 students. Each one took a chapter. They had to write and explain it to a 7th grade brother or sister, and then read it out loud. We did 33 in a row, and it reads like C.S. Lewis. You feel C.S. Lewis, even though it's a student explaining it to a little brother or sister who's looking bored.
This is excellent. So Mark Cosgrove is talking about taking honors students through a translation project in Mere Christianity, having the students take individual chapters, and the assignment is to translate that chapter, explain it to how they would a 7th grader to help with this problem, right? Help them clarify the thought, help them have to translate themselves. And
They had to take just a few pages. They couldn't bore the kid for 15 minutes.
That's great. That's great. Just a few pages of the chapter.
Do you act as the 7th grader who just
I told the 7th graders, you can't just look bored the whole time. You got to play along, but be good. Well,
An amazing assignment. Rob.
I read the A.N. Wilson biography many years ago. But it's interesting because you're looking at Lewis's biography from the point of view of a reporter, skeptic, non-Christian, and it's really interesting. But the impression I remember from it is just simply that he thought he was Sigmund Freud and knew what was in Lewis's head, and totally threw out the spirit, the saved by Christ part of it. And it's just interesting. I mean, here's a case where, and I think it's where we have to be so careful of what we read today, is that he was factual, and yet he infused it with what he thought Lewis was thinking. And I think we see that in the political realm today. We assume that, oh, you're against that, then you must be thinking this. And, somehow we're able to get in people's heads, and I think that's what A.N. Wilson did with his biography.
Great. So the comment is that A.N. Wilson's biography is over-psychologizing about Lewis's life, and that he takes away Lewis's own interpretation of his own life and foists upon it his point of view. Is he an investigative journalist? I don't actually know.
He was a journalist. He worked for the Spectator and some other
Okay.
other things. But to me, it just seemed like thought he was very. To me, it comes across as Freudian. I may be off. I'm not.
I think he was on a journey because I think he's a Christian now.
He wrote some pretty nasty stuff later, though. Not related to this.
Yeah, that I don't know, but he did a
I think you might
film.
be right. I think you might be right.
2013, he did a film based on his book, which is really quite appreciative. So if you go to YouTube and put in A.N. Wilson, C.S. Lewis, you probably view it. Because for nothing else, it shows a lot of the places that are associated with Lewis. So it's kind of fun to see, this is the path that he walked on when he had the conversation with Tolkien. This is the lecture hall in which he did this or that.
Right.
It's fun work.
So Steve's comment is that there is a YouTube video that where A.N. Wilson is the principal narrator. It actually includes some interviews between Wilson and McGrath, and is more sympathetic perhaps in this biography. And that the video itself is super interesting because it takes you to these places, and you can see with really nice video work these places that we're talking about. So yeah, Rob.
Just around that, I think Steve's right. I do believe I've seen some things about him coming to Christ.
That A.N. Wilson may
in
have
his
come to
life.
Christ later in his life.
But just to make the comment, I think it's good to understand that we become so much wiser as we get older.
We become wiser as we get older. That's true. That's good. Great, Eric.
Yeah, I got a comment on Mere Christianity. I was introduced to it by Dan while I was living with him, and I had to listen to it on audio, and I maybe picked up 10%, but it's a book I go through annually on audio, and it's still a gold mine.
It's still a gold mine.
It's an unbelievable. It's my second favorite book to the Bible, and I encourage everybody. It's something to dust off the shelf and read it again because it will blow you away every time.
Good. Strong endorsement from Eric Glosser for the ongoing relevance of Mere Christianity. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, I'm going to turn off the live stream, and then Ward's going to come up and make an announcement. So thanks again, guys, for being here. Also, live streamers for tuning in. We will see you next week.